If you ask a disagreeable person what he wants, say, or she wants, they'll tell you right away. They know. It's like, this is what I want and this is how I'm going to get it. But agreeable people, especially if they're really agreeable, are so agreeable that they often don't even know what they want, because they're so accustomed to living for other people and to finding out what other people want and to trying to make them comfortable and so forth, that it's harder for them to find a sense of their own desires as they move through life. And that's not, look, there's situations where that's advantageous, but it's certainly not advantageous if you're going to try to forge yourself a career. That just doesn't work at all. And so even though on average men and women aren't that much different in terms of their levels of agreeableness by the group, if you go out and you look at the extremes, they're very different. So all of the most agreeable people are women and all of the most disagreeable people are men. And the thing is, the extremes are often what matter rather than what's in the middle. And so one of the ways that's reflected in society, by the way, is there's way more men in prison. And the best personality predictor of being imprisoned is to be low in agreeableness. It makes you callous. Now you might think, well, what's the opposite of compassion and politeness? And the answer to that is, I think it's best sort of conceptualized as a trading game. So let's say that we're going to play repeated trading games. And if you're very agreeable, then you're going to bargain harder on my behalf than you're going to bargain on your own behalf. Whereas if you're very disagreeable, you're going to do the reverse. You're going to think, I'm in this trading game for me, and you're going to take care of your own interests. Where an agreeable person is going to say, no, at best this is, at worst this has to be 50-50, but I'd like to help you every way I can. One of the things you have to be careful of if you're agreeable is not to be exploited, because you'll line up to be exploited. And I think the reason for that is because you're wired to be exploited by infants. And so that just doesn't work so well in that actual world. And one of the things that happens very often in psychotherapy, people come to psychotherapy for multiple reasons, but one of them is they often come because they're too agreeable. And so what they get is so-called assertiveness training, although it's not exactly assertiveness that's being trained. What it is the ability to learn how to negotiate on your own behalf. And one of the things I tell agreeable people, especially if they're conscientious, is say what you think. Tell the truth about what you think. There's going to be things you think that you think are nasty and harsh, and they probably are nasty and harsh, but they're also probably true. And you need to bring those up to the forefront and deliver the message. And it's not straightforward at all, because agreeable people do not like conflict. Not at all. They smooth the water. And you can see why that is in accordance with the hypothesis that I've been putting forward. You don't want conflict around infants. It's too damn dangerous. You don't want fights to break out. You don't want anything to disturb the relative peace. And if you're also more prone to being hurt physically and perhaps emotionally, you're also maybe loath to engage in the kind of high-intensity conflict that will solve problems in the short term, because it takes a lot of conflict to solve problems in the short term. And if that can spiral up to where it's dangerous, which it can if it gets uncontrolled, it might be safer in the short term to keep the waters smooth and to not delve into those situations where conflict emerges. The problem with that is it's not a very good medium to long-term strategy, right? Because lots of times there are things you have to talk about because they're not going to go away. And the advantage to having a well-socialized disagreeable person is that they really don't let much get in their way. So if you can get a kid who's disagreeable socialized, that person can be quite the creature, because they're very forward-moving in their nature and very difficult to stop. But if you don't get them successfully domesticated, tamed, roughly speaking, by the time they're 4, their peers reject them. And that's a big problem, because your job as a parent is to make your child socially desirable by the age of 4. Like you want to burn that into your brain, because people don't know that. That's your job. And here's why. It's easy if you think about it carefully. So you imagine you've got a 3-year-old child, so sort of halfway through that initial period of socialization, and you take that child out in public. Okay, what do you want for the child? Who cares about you? What do you want for the child? You want the child to be able to interact with other children and adults so that the children are welcoming and smile and want to play with him or her, and so the adults are happy to see the child and treat him or her properly. And if your child's a horrible little monster because you're afraid of disciplining them or you don't know how to do that properly, then what they're going to do is they're going to experience nothing but rejection from other children and false smiles from other parents and adults. And so then you're throwing the child out there into a world where every single face that they see is either hostile or lying. And that's not something that's going to be particularly conducive to the mental health or the well-being of your child. If your child can learn a couple simple rules of behavior, like don't interrupt adults when they're talking too much, and pay attention, and try not to hit the other kids over the head with the truck any more than is absolutely necessary, then, and share and play properly, then when they meet other kids, the kids are going to try out a few little play routines on them, and that's going to go well, and then they're going to go off and socialize each other for the rest of their lives. Because that's what happens, is that from 4 years old onwards, the primary socialization with children takes place among other children. And so if the kids don't get in on that early, they don't move into that developmental spiral upwards, and they're left behind. And you can imagine how terrible that is, because a 4-year-old will not play with another 4-year-old who's 2. But a 5-year-old certainly will not play with a 5-year-old who's 2, right? Because the gap is just starting to get unbelievably large. And so the kids start out behind, and then the peers leave them behind, and then those kids are alienated and outside the peer group for the rest of their life. Well, those are the ones that grow up to be long-term antisocial, right? They're already aggressive. It doesn't dip down. Now, what happens to normal boys, roughly speaking? Imagine the aggressive 2-year-old types. They get socialized, so their level of aggression goes down, and then they hit puberty and testosterone kicks in, and bang, levels of aggression go back up. And so that's why males are criminals between the ages roughly of 16 and about 25. So, and it matches the creativity curve, by the way. It's so cool. If you look at the spike of creativity among men, 16 to 25, and it starts to go down, criminality matches that absolutely perfectly. So that's quite cool. So, and so the testosterone levels raise the average level of aggression among men. It's more dominance than aggression, actually, and testosterone is by no means all bad. And then it starts to decrease at about age 25 or 26, which is usually when men stop staying up late at night, stop drinking as much, develop a full-time career, and take on the burdens and responsibilities and opportunities that are associated with a long-term partner and family. And so, well, so that's the development of what I would call predatory aggression, because I also think that the agreeableness distribution is probably something like predatory aggression versus maternal sympathy. It's something like that. So if you look at other mammals that are predators, because we're predators as well as prey animals, if you look at other animals like bears, the male bear has absolutely nothing to do with the raising of the infants. In fact, the female bears will keep the male the hell away, because he's likely to kill the infants and maybe even to eat them. So there's no maternality at all in solitary male mammalian predators. It's really useful to investigate the viewpoints of people who have opposing views to yours, because they'll tell you things. Not only will they tell you things you don't know, they'll also tell you how to see the world in ways that you don't see it. And they'll also have skills that you don't have, that you could develop. So for example, if you're an introverted person, it's very useful to watch an extroverted person, because the extroverted person has ways of being in the social world that aren't natural to you, that you can use to improve your toolkit. And if you're disagreeable, one of the best things to do with disagreeable people, especially if that's alienating them from other people, for example, because it can, people treat you like you're a selfish, arrogant son of a, maybe that's because you are. It's like, okay, so what do you do about that? One of the most promising treatments, let's say, for that is get the person to do something for someone else once a day, just as a practice, and learn how to do it. Maybe you can wake the circuit up, if you think that it's lying dormant in you, which is probably right. I think we have a very wide range of propensities within us. Some are switched on, genetic propensities. Some are switched on, but I think that if you put yourself in the right situation or walk yourself through the right exercises, you can switch some of these other things on as well. But it takes work and dedication and discipline. I would say, generally speaking, if you want to adapt yourself properly to life, you should find a niche in the environment that corresponds with your temperament. Right? You shouldn't work at cross purposes to your temperament, because it's just too damn difficult. But having done that, then you should work on developing the skills and viewpoints that exist in the space opposite to your personality, because that's where you're fundamentally underdeveloped. And that way I think you can extend out your temperamental capability across a wider range. And to me, that's roughly equivalent as bringing a richer toolkit to each situation. You know, so if you're hyper extroverted, you should probably learn to shut up at parties now and then and listen just to see what's going on, to see if you can manage it, you know. And if you're introverted, well, then you should learn how to speak in public and to learn how to go to parties without hiding in the corner and saying nothing to anyone. You know, and if you're agreeable, then you need to learn how to be disagreeable so people can't push you around. And if you're disagreeable, you need to learn how to be agreeable so that you're not an evil son of a bitch. So, and the same thing applies even in the conscientious domain. It's like if you're too conscientious, you need to learn to relax and let go a little bit. And if you're unconscientious, it's time, like, get out the Google Calendar, man, and start scheduling your day, right? And beat yourself on the back of the head with a stick until you're disciplined enough so that you can actually stick to something for some length of time and not living in absolute squalor, which is something that would characterize someone who's very disorderly, for example, because they don't notice. It doesn't bother them, disorder. It's like, maybe they can see it, but it doesn't have any emotional valence, and so it doesn't have any motivational significance. You know, so the other thing you might want to think about too, if you're choosing a partner, is try not to choose someone who's too distant from you on the temperamental variables, because you're going to have a hard time bridging the gap. You know, it's hard for an introverted person and an extroverted person to coexist. And it's really hard for an orderly person and a disorderly person to coexist, because they will drive each other nuts. Why don't you pick up? Why are you so obsessed by it? That's the basic argument, you know. So it's useful to know about your temperament so that you can negotiate the space with your partner as well. And I don't think you should try to find someone who's exactly the same as you, because then you don't have the benefits of the alternative viewpoint. But you got to watch it, because you may hit irreconcilable differences of various sorts. And I've seen that most particularly among couples who are high and low in openness. That's a rough one. And also high and low in conscientiousness. That's another rough one, because they just cannot see how the other person sees the world at all. If you're being required to do things that make you weak and ashamed, then stop. Don't do them. Like, one of the things I learned from Solzhenitsyn and Frankl was that systems go terribly out of control when people don't stop them when they're going mildly out of control. You know, and you might say, I should just keep my goddamn head down and shut up. It's like, maybe you should. Like, that's not bad advice. You know, you don't want to make unnecessary enemies, and you don't need any more trouble than you need. But you got to ask yourself on a day-to-day basis, what makes you think you're not selling your soul? You know, and there's so much foolishness going on in the mid-level bureaucratic world now. That's where all the tyranny seems to be focused. And the reason that it multiplies is because sensible people say nothing when they should say something. And what's so strange about that is that there are way more sensible people than people who aren't sensible. They're just not as noisy. So what you'll turn out if, like, you know, so let's say something's bugging the hell out of you at work. Well, then you have to prepare to find another job. That's the first thing you have to do. I don't think that you should find another job, but you should prepare to find another job. And if possible, you should prepare to find a better job. Because if you can't tell someone to go to hell, then you can't negotiate with them. And if they've got you over a barrel, then you can't say anything. So you gotta set yourself up so you've got some mobility. And actually, that's a really good principle in your life, period. You should set yourself up so that you have a lateral move at hand. And then you should find out, well, are there things at work that are disturbing my soul? You know, and you find that out. First of all, you ask yourself, okay, I'm disturbed at work. Okay, I'm probably weak and deceitful and useless and lazy. You might as well start with that. And then you talk to some people, like your wife, your friends, your co-workers, and find out, are you stupid, deceitful, and lazy? Or is there something not so good going on at work? And so if you can then eliminate your own personal pathology as a cause of your dissatisfaction, then maybe there's something rotten in the state of Denmark. And maybe you should say something about it before the whole goddamn thing collapses, because that can happen. It can happen in companies a lot faster than people ever think. You know, and you may find that, well, first of all, you may find if you say something, well, first of all, that's an adventure, that's for sure. That's a bloody adventure. And you have to do it carefully. And you have to be prepared for it. But it might be the best thing that ever happened to you. And the other thing is, if you're careful about it, you get your words right. Like, and this is this is strategic battle, right? It's not something you wander into carelessly. Then you may find that there's lots of people who feel exactly the same way you do, and that you've actually cottoned on to something. You're a canary in a coal mine, and not just some like psychopathic mouthpiece. So you got to ask yourself when you go and do what you do, like, is this making you stronger? Is this making you weaker? And if it's making you weaker, then you got to ask yourself, do you really want to be weaker? Because the weaker you get, the more you're tyrannized. And then worse than that, like the weaker you get, the more bitter you get. And the more you'll work towards terrible things, the more you'll snap at your wife, the more you'll kick your kids, you know. Like, it's no joke to be tyrannized at work. And so I would say you have an ethical responsibility as a citizen to forthrightly confront creeping tyranny no matter where it occurs. And part of what we're learning, I would say, from these stories, if we're learning anything at all, is that if you're aimed at the good, which is a question you really got to ask yourself, you know, if you're genuinely aimed at the good, then take heart, because you're a lot stronger than you think. And so the psychopath will use his ability to fool you as proof of his own grandiose omnipotence, omniscience, and narcissism. And the problem with that is that you can be fooled by a psychopath, and virtually anybody can. So that Robert Hare, for example, who studied psychopaths for a long time and interviewed a lot of them, like hundreds of them, and videotaped many of the interviews, he said when he was talking to the psychopath, he always believed what they were saying. And then he'd watch the video afterwards and see where the conversation went off the rails. But, you know, the proclivity to be polite in a conversation is very strong. And if you're polite, you don't object to the way that the person unfolds their strategy, you know. And psychopaths are pretty good at figuring out how to manipulate, obviously, how to manipulate people. And the probability that you will be immune to that is extraordinarily low. Go watch Paul Bernardo being interviewed by policemen on YouTube. That's that's enlightening, man. Paul Bernardo, he's like the CEO of a meeting in that video, you know. He gives the cops hell, he gives the lawyers hell, he protests his innocence. He basically tells them that they're rude and untrustworthy because they don't trust him because he did a few little things 17 years ago. And he gets away with it, a few little things, right? I mean, he killed a bunch of people, including the sister of his girlfriend at the time. And, you know, he was a repeat sexual offender and murderer. It's like, but he basically goes, well, you know, that's a long time ago. It's like, we're past that, aren't we? I mean, I'm having a discussion with you. I'm trying to help you solve some crimes, which, by the way, I committed, but we won't bring that up. You know, and you're accusing me of being a liar. Like, you're not playing fair. What's up with you? And then when they answer, he looks at his fingernails, which is like, that's a lovely little manipulative thing, because it basically means whatever happens to be under my fingernail at the moment is much higher priority than listening to your foolish story. And you watch, you'll see people do that to you. And then you get a little insight into what they're up to. He's very good at that. And so, or he looks outside, or he just looks at his hands, or he looks out the window, immediately dismissive in his nonverbal behavior. It's brilliant. The courts were forced to release that, by the way. But look it up, Paul Bernardo on YouTube. Wow, it's just mind-boggling. He's so good at what he does. And he's good-looking, and he's charismatic, and, you know, he can really pull it off. And you can't tell what's happening with the cops and the lawyers, whether they're just letting him play his routine to get some information from him, or whether he's actually setting them back on his heels. And I suspect it's a bit of both. But it's masterful performance. If you didn't know who he was, and you were watching it without the audio, you'd think, he's the CEO of some company giving his employees hell for not being up to scratch. That's all his body language, his eye contact, everything just speaks that. It's amazing. A narcissist, as far as I'm concerned, and you tell me what you think about this. So a narcissist fundamentally is someone who manipulates to achieve unearned reputational status. Now, so I know that needs to be fleshed out, but that seems to me to be something like at the core of it. And perhaps the reason that works is because once you establish a social hierarchy that's functional, the higher you are in the hierarchy, the more resources accrue to you. And for men in particular, that also involves reproductive success, because the best predictor of mate access for men is relative position in a hierarchy. It's a huge predictor.
Now you can mimic that as a narcissist, right? You can make a show of yourself. You can display a confidence that would normally be associated with competence, but it's not real. But it's real enough to fool people, right? It's real enough to fool naive young women, for example, and it's real enough to allow you to maneuver into positions into high resource positions. So is that in keeping with your conceptualization of narcissism?
Yeah, there's so much here I'm going to take this in pieces. First, I do think that idea of unearned status is really important with narcissism, but there's also the case of people, and I'm thinking of Bill Clinton in particular after he was president, but I'm sure it applies to President Trump, not picking parties here, where you have somebody that really is successful, really is competent, and still has the need for attention, still has the need to be admired, even though they have all those things. So it's not necessarily only unearned. It's like, hey, I just want attention. Whereas other people, like, I go out there, I do my best. I just want to go home with my family. I don't need the attention. So I think it can be, people enjoy the earned attention too, to some extent, but it always gets to the point where you want more than you deserve. So there's an inflation component with narcissism. So I do think that, but I do think there are people who are very competent and narcissistic.
Yeah, okay, that's a good distinction.
So I wanted to go back to your alpha question because it's so interesting. Where it hit me, I was in South Africa looking at a group of gazelle of some sort with the guide, and I was watching the alpha running around mate guarding. And I said to my guide, I'm like, what's going on here? And he goes, well, he's the alpha. He has to spend his life mate guarding to make sure the other guys don't come in. I said, how long does he last in this role of an alpha? He goes, well, about a season, and then he'll die because your cortisol's up. And in the human condition, what we have are reverse hierarchies. I mean, this is Freud and totem and taboo. This is essentially the tension in the human system. So if you're an alpha and you're like, I'm not working with the younger guys are going to band together and take you out. And you're going to have an unstable system in a short-term reign or short-term rule. But if, as you say, and like Franz de Waal said, is if you align the alpha with a group of, become the peacemaker, work with the younger guys, you're going to be stable and have a more stable society. So I totally agree with that. I think this idea when I hear young guys saying, I want to be an alpha, I'm like, really? Are you sure? Like being alpha is hard. And then somebody takes you out in a year, not the best long-term strategy.
Yeah, well, you see that with gang members. I mean, we know something about the psychology of gang members, and it's clearly the case that in gang members or among gang members, the more narcissistic, aggressive, manipulative, psychopathic types who are certainly prone to turn to violence can rise, but their lifespan tends to be extremely short. And then they also adopt an attitude towards the world, which is associated with a truncated temporal view, which is I'm going to get every goddamn thing I can get my hands on right now. And you can understand the attractiveness of that if the alternative is I never get anything I want and I also die quickly. But it's not a very good solution when you could be successful and productive, and that could span decades and also be of service to other people. We should point out too that this discussion that we're having, it strikes to the core of cultural critique as well, because one of the things that we see happening continually, throughout human history, but I guess it's been amplified intellectually more since the time of Marx, is this insistence that male sociological structures are oppressive patriarchies. And, we need to take that apart, because we could say at a more sophisticated level that if the male hierarchy deteriorates in the direction of narcissistic power, then it becomes an oppressive patriarchy. But if it's bounded by the necessity of productive, iterable interactions of the sort that define, let's say, de Waal's peacemaking chimps, then there's nothing about the patriarchy that's oppressive at all. All that means, if it's oppressive, that means that it's not structured optimally, either for the people who are in the positions of authority and responsibility or for anybody else. But the crucial issue here is that it's certainly possible to structure hierarchies of responsibility so that they're not narcissistic and dominance based.
Oh, absolutely. That's how they mostly are. I mean, narcissistic leaders, when they get in power, are generally unstable. People, they get one group of people who love them, another group of people who don't like them. Again, they tend to be less ethical. They tend to get taken out. It just takes some time for it to happen. So it's not a stable system, and it can become toxic. But a healthy, well-adjusted group of guys, I mean, guys get together and they try to align towards a goal. So if I took a bunch of guys and said, let's go fight that monster over there, we'd all get together and fight the monster and have a great time. So guys can work together if they're not doing a bunch of ego stuff, if they're focused on goals.
So the standard personality models that produce the big five, extroversion, neuroticism, agreeableness, conscientiousness, and openness, they were derived sort of with a primitive AI, that's a way of thinking about it, that looked for patterns of description across huge corpuses of linguistic data. How do people talk about each other? It turns out they talk about each other using 5 dimensions, and those are the dimensions I just described. But the people who derived the big five didn't use evaluative descriptors. They threw anything out that looked like a value judgment. So, for example, you might say of someone, he's a good person, and you might say of someone else, he's a malevolent person. Those descriptors weren't included in the big five corpus because they were trying to derive a model of normative personality. Okay, so, but that meant that the pathological personality wasn't encapsulated or well defined. Now, this guy Robert Hare, who worked at University of British Columbia as world's leading authority on psychopathy, and he interviewed hundreds and hundreds of psychopaths and was always fooled by them, by the way. And then he had a student, Del Paulus, who works at UBC, and Paulus developed a model of personality that was based on pathology, like on the dark side. And he called that the dark triad. Machiavellianism, that means Machiavellian is someone who, so let's say if I was Machiavellian in our discussions, what I would have done was think, before I came here, I thought, well, what can Joe offer me? And then I'd think, well, how can I play Joe with my language so I'm most likely to get what I'm, the narrow, impulsive, selfish thing that I'm aiming at right now. So that's how a Machiavellian operates. A narcissist, that's the next part of the dark triad, is someone who wants social status without doing any of the work. They want all the attention. If you're dating a narcissist or in a relationship with a narcissist, they'll alienate all your family members and your friends so that they get all the attention. And that'll just be the first of the games they play with you.
Yeah.
Then you have psychopathy, and the psychopaths are parasitical predators. And so the predator will take whatever you've got, and the parasite will live off you. And then here's a parasitical ideological statement. Property is theft, a classic Marxist trope. Why would you say that? Well, if I want to live off you, the way I'm going to justify that ethically is by claiming, well, Joe, look how privileged you are. You've got all this money. You just took that from the oppressed. And if I'm manipulating you so that I get some of your money, that's only just because, first of all, it's exactly what you did. And second of all, well, why not spread some of that wealth around? So that's Machiavellianism, narcissism, and psychopathy, dark triad. They've expanded that recently to add another dimension that was missing, sadism. And the sadist takes positive delight in causing pain to others. And the lulz culture, L-U-L-Z, the lulz culture online is a culture of sadistic, Machiavellian, narcissistic psychopaths.
Lulz, meaning like people are joking around shit posting.
Yeah. I did it for the lulz, and it's the plural of LOL, laugh out loud. But like if you look at the Urban Dictionary, for example, the definition of lulz is positive delight in the suffering of others. It's like, it's sadistic. And bloody well, social media just facilitates like
I never thought of lulz as being sadistic.
It's in and of itself, it's not a sufficient marker, right? You have to have like 6 or 7 things going on before it's clear that you're manifesting this underlying tetrad of personality traits. Like if you use the odd acronym and you're throwing out a joke at someone, this is a habitual pattern of doing nothing but provoking people online and using deception and lies to do it to attract attention to yourself. It has to be a very consistent pattern. But Paulos, first of all, and his crew of researchers and people who've been influenced by him have laid out this 4-dimensional structure of the dark side, let's say. And they've shown that hyper users of social media, Instagram, for example, and people who do a lot of anonymous shit posting are characterized by, you know, what would you call it? Domination by those 4 traits. And part of the reason for that, this is very, very dangerous to our whole society, I think, is that you got to ask yourself what keeps the psychopaths under control in the normal population. And the answer seems to be, especially on the male side, is that narcissistic aggressive men get put in their place by non-narcissistic aggressive men. And that usually has to do with something like the threat of physical intervention. You know how it is if you get a bunch of guys together. I can make a joke about you, you know, and I could even make a joke that was that sort of put you down. But the joke would have to be funny. You'd have to have the opportunity to reciprocate, and you'd have to believe that I was doing it in good spirit. Because if I just used the opportunity to, you know, stick the knife in, we're not going to get along with each other very long. And we know that, and men know that when they talk to each other. And so part of what keeps dialogue among men civilized is the possibility that it won't be civilized if it goes too sideways. And everybody knows that. But there is none of that online, because anybody can post anything about anyone, no matter how denigrating and derisive, especially if they do it anonymously, and there's zero consequence. In fact, quite the opposite. If they're good at it, they get a lot of attention, and the social media companies will monetize it. And so not only is it not inhibited, it's actually facilitated. And this isn't a trivial problem, because if the psychopaths multiply enough, they take the whole society out. So I think virtualization enables psychopathy. And it's worse than just the trolling bit. That's bad enough, because it pollutes political dialogue and it makes everyone think that everything is more unstable than it really is. But online criminality is actually a terrible plague. You know, I don't think there's an old person in North America who isn't being targeted by some gang of psychopaths who's, you know, documented all of their interests and their locale, and who knows how much money's in their bank account, and who's doing everything they possibly can at every second to leverage access to it. That's just happening continually. If you could have what you wanted in this moment, and I could deliver it, what would it be? How much of the mess that you see around you would vanish if the mess that you could put straight was put straight? You know perfectly well that if you put your mind to it and you make the proper sacrifices, there are things you can set straight.
What advice do you have for a young man in his 20s?
Make a plan. Look at what you're interested in. Get disciplined about something. Allow for the possibility that you have something important to contribute to the world, and that the world would be a lesser place without that contribution. Don't be afraid of taking on responsibility. It's where you find what sustains you in your life. You can take on too much responsibility. You have to be cautious in that regard, but that's a less common problem than not taking on enough. A lot of the things that people regard as traps are actually the means to their life. You have to understand that you're not your own servant, so to speak. You're someone that you have to negotiate with, and you're someone that you want to present the opportunity of having a good life to. And that's hard for people because they don't like themselves very much. You have to believe that your action has some redemptive possibility, because why would you do it otherwise? And you might say, well, I kind of believe that. It's like, well, that's not good enough. You know, you kind of got to throw yourself all into it. And what's the cost anyways? It's not like you're going to get out of this alive. So you're pretty much all in, whether you want to be or not. And maybe if you were voluntarily all in, things would be a lot better than they are. If the world isn't everything that you want it to be, maybe you're not acting the way you should. One of the things people do to buttress themselves against failure is to never let themselves really gain clarity about what they need and want. Let's say you try something, but you only do it half-heartedly. And then you fail, and you think, well, I didn't really fail because, you know, I held a bunch back in reserve, And so I didn't get what I wanted, but maybe had I been all in, I would have. And so you don't have to upbraid yourself too much for the failure. Now, it's a catastrophic way to live, to sit on the fence and to not commit, because instead of risking the possibility of failure, you engage in what's essentially the absolute certainty of failure. Because if you want something worthwhile and difficult, which you probably do if you want to have an adventure and go somewhere, then what's the chance you're going to get it if you're halfway in? You can't be halfway in, but that sort of protects you against failure, because you can tell yourself, well, if I tried, I could have done it. It's like, you know, you tell yourself that 200 times and your life's over. Better have a valued goal, because otherwise you can't get any positive motivation working out. And so the more valuable the goal, in principle, the more the micro processes associated with that goal start to take on a positive charge. And so what that means is, well, you get up in the morning and you're excited about the day, you're ready to go. And so as far as I can tell, what you do is you specify your long-term ideal, you specify your goal. You do that in some sense as a unique individual. You want to specify goals that make you say, oh, if that could happen as a consequence of my efforts, it would clearly be worthwhile. Would it really be so terrible if my life wasn't miserable? Would it be so terrible if I got what I wanted and needed, especially if I was doing that in the best possible way? Well, there isn't anything better to have than a problem that's worth solving, like that's really worth solving, right? And so the more of that you take on, the more you have a reason to get out of bed in the morning, no matter what. Like, I'm getting up, I'm trudging forward. Doesn't matter what I'm suffering from. I've got things that need to be done. They're necessary. And that gives you that sense of purpose that is the antidote to bitterness. So, yeah, there's lots of reasons to, you know, because I've thought for a long time, imagine you have a choice in front of you, because you do. So here's the choice. Your life is either meaningful or meaningless. Okay, so let's go through the meaningless part first. Because you think, well, of course I don't want it to be meaningless. It's like, yeah, just hold on a second. Nothing you do matters. And so impulsive pleasure is the order of the day. No responsibility. You can do whatever you want. It's like Pleasure Island in Pinocchio, right? Or it's like Neverland in Peter Pan. You're still a kid. You can play all the time. Yeah. Impulsive pleasure and no responsibility. That's the reward for meaninglessness. Well, but then the other side is, okay, well, let's say you want your life to be meaningful. It's like, okay, then what you do matters. It actually matters, right? Make a mistake, hurts you, hurts your family, hurts the world in a deeper way than you think. And you have to be awake to that. And then you have to take it on yourself.
Right? They're all like, why should I stand up, be a martyr, get fired? This guy at Google got fired.
Yeah.
How do you convince people that there's a point to standing up when it appears to be futile?
Well, the first thing I think is you convince them that it's not futile. It might be difficult, but it's not futile. If you get your words right, you have something to say, there'll be an impact of those words. It might not be the impact that you would choose. But the other thing you got to tell people is, pick your poison. You may be in a situation where you don't have a cakewalk to the Garden of Paradise. You got tyranny or famine. Those are your choices. But you get to pick which one you have. And I would say if you're being oppressed, and I mean in your soul, by what you're required to swallow at work, well, you think you're not paying a price for that? You got no self-respect, and rightly so. But worse than that, you're an agent of your own destruction. You're destroying your own ideal, and you're letting people who are weak and corrupt win. And if you stood up and stood up properly, but you have to put yourself in order to do this, at least to some degree, right? You can't do it casually. You have to do it from some position of preparedness and strength. Then what makes you think you couldn't scare them back into the corners? And that would be a good thing. And, you know, the alternative personally is bad because there's a psychological degeneration that goes along with it. I've seen this with many, many of the people that I've worked with who have been tyrannized in the workplace to the absolute detriment of their psychological and physical health, right? To the point of collapse, confronting these crazy, crazy things when they were sensible people. That's a terrible price to pay, man. Like it's a bad price. And then if the foolishness isn't dealt with at the local level, when it's still relatively trivial, then it will multiply until it's dealt with at the social level. And we're seeing signs of that already. Antifa is a good sign of that. You know, and problems that aren't solved multiply, and soon people fight. And you know, better to argue than to fight. Unless you want to fight. And some people want to fight. And I can understand why, but I wouldn't recommend it, because that doesn't lead good places. It really doesn't lead good places. So I'd say you have a duty. Maybe that's why you stand up. It's because you have a goddamn duty to stand up and just say what you have to say. You don't even have to be trying to make a point exactly or trying to get something done. It's like, this is how it looks to me. That's what that guy at Google did. He wrote this memo and he said, I talked to him today. He said, well, he went to a diversity training seminar and he thought, no, I don't agree with that. And so then they asked for feedback. So we wrote this document a month ago. This was written a month ago. Got no real response to it. Well, it bounced around inside Google until a lot of people, you know, got interested in it, and then it escaped into the outside world. But all he was doing was, he was told a bunch of things he didn't think were true. He wrote down a bunch of things he thought were probably true. He launched that out and said, well, I think these things are probably true. It's like, well, probably they're true. Well, so he paid a price for it, but maybe we'll see what sort of price he paid for it. Man, he's going to be a lot tougher in 2 years than he was 2 years ago. You know, like I reviewed this guy's document. I did that yesterday. And everything he said was validated by the scientific literature. So what has happened is that someone has been fired publicly by a major corporation for stating well-grounded scientific truths. Right. They're exactly the sorts of things that I say in my classes, for example. And the reason that I say them is because I read the literature. It's not because I'm personally happy about the facts. I think IQ research particularly is so dismal that you can't possibly read it without being seriously disheartened. If I could reconstruct the world so that the IQ research wasn't true, well, it'd sure be tempting, you know? But that's not how science works. Science doesn't tell you what you want to hear. It just tells you the way it bloody well is. And he got pilloried for revealing a good fraction of current scientific knowledge about gender differences. Okay, that's not good. And as you said, that's a big company and it controls our communication. So how about we do what we can to ensure that these large communication companies don't get to impose a factually false ideological structure on the rest of the planet. Well, you can think about supporting this guy who blew the whistle. There's a fundraiser for him online. He could use some money. He wants to sue Google. Yeah. You know, maybe we could let them know that hiring a human resources director who's also concerned with equity is probably not a good idea for a capitalist company. Why in the world would you hire your own enemies? I don't understand that. So, well, we'll see how the dialogue continues. But back to the personal, like, you need to say what you think because that's where you come from, right? And if you don't say what you think, then you kill your unborn self. That's what you do. That's what Cain did when he killed Abel. And that's why his punishment was unbearable. You know, you have things in you that are struggling to come to the light. That's the truth you need to utter. And you need to utter that truth because without that truth, you cannot live in the world. Because the world's real and you need truth to live in the world. And if you stifle your truth, well, how can that be anything but something that brings about hell? How could it be any other way? So you think, well, why should you speak up? That's easy, because the consequences of not speaking up, although delayed, are far worse. That's the reason. That's the reason. If it can't be courage, it could at least be prudence.
if you're an agreeable person, and that means you're fundamentally compassionate and caring, you don't like conflict, you like to put other people at ease, you're likely to go along to get along. Now, the problem with being a caring person is that, of that sort, an agreeable person, is that you don't like conflict, you're going to always assume the best of others, and it's going to be difficult for you to say no when you need to say no. And what no means, by the way, just so that everyone who is listening is clear, no, when you say it to someone, means if you don't stop doing that, something you do not like will happen to you with 100% certainty. That's what no means if you dare utter it. It's useful to develop that side of your character, too, the part that can bite back when bitten. Not more than necessary, but certainly not less than necessary.
What do you do when you go to a movie? You fasten onto a character, and you understand that character the same way that you understand people that you're in conversation with. Now, you might think that the way that you understand people is by you listen to what they say and you extract out the knowledge that they're delivering to you in terms of facts, and you interpret the facts and you derive your understanding of the person. Like, none of that's true. That has absolutely nothing to do with how you establish a relationship with someone. And, well, here's some proof. Is that what you do with a dog? Well, obviously not, but you can establish a relationship with a dog. And the relationship you have with a dog, it's not the same as the relationship with a person, but a dog's a pack animal. A dog can become a member of the family. You can understand a dog well enough so the dog likes you. Right, and so whatever you're doing with the dog, it isn't discourse about propositions, because most of the dogs you own don't talk. It's the same with an infant. You establish a relationship using mechanisms that aren't propositional. They're not rules, they're not descriptions, they're not facts. That's not how you do it. How do you do it? Where do you look when you talk to someone? You look at their eyes. Why? To see where they're pointing them. Why? So you can see what they're looking at. Why? So you can infer what's important to them, because we point our eyes at that which is important to us. That's why our eyes look the way they look. Black in the middle, colored on that ring around that against a white background. That's an evolved mechanism. I can see your eyes. All of our ancestors whose eyes weren't visible either got killed or didn't reproduce. The one thing you want to know about someone right away is where the hell their eyes are pointed. And you can do that politely, which you do by attending to someone without too predatory a stare. You do that by attending politely to their face, but not too intensely, and not attending, let's say, inappropriately to other parts of their body. And they're going to be watching you to see what you do with your eyes. Because the one thing you want to know about someone, above all else, is what the hell are they up to, right? What's their aim? And so when you go to a movie, that's what you do. When you watch a character in a role, you see him in a variety of different situations, and you watch how he structures his attention, what he pays attention to, because attention is a costly business, and so people pay attention to what they value. You watch what they attend to, and you watch how they prioritize their actions, and from that you derive an understanding of what's important to them. As soon as you understand what's important to them, you've got their aim. You figured that character out. This is what you do when you learn to know someone. What's their aim? As soon as you know their aim, you can see the world through their eyes. You can see the same objects they see, and the objects take on the same emotional significance. And when you say, I come to understand someone, what you really mean is, oh, I understand their aim, and now I can aim at the same thing, at least in simulation, at least fictionally, and I can come to inhabit the same world of perception and emotion that they inhabit. I can even guess at how they might act and to what they might attend in situations I haven't seen, because now I know their aim. What's he up to? That's what you're thinking in a murder mystery or in a thriller. What's he up to? What's he up to? What's going to happen next?
What would you estimate are the boundaries between self-care and selfishness?
Well, that's a good follow-up question for what we've been just discussing. Well, the first thing we have to sort out there is, well, what do you mean by self? And people make memes about me because I'm always
asking for word definitions. But, and it annoys people because they think, well, it's just, you know what that means. It's like, is God real? What do you mean by real? Well, you can't ask that. It's like, well, then you can't ask your question either. What do you mean real? Well, everyone understands that. It's like, really, we do we? We understand what's real. We've got that nailed down. What you're really asking is something like, here's what I am insisting that you regard as real, which is usually something like an objective materialism. Does God fit into that category? It's like, well, that's a completely different question than the one you asked. No, perhaps, is the answer to that question, but you didn't formulate the question reasonably, because when you formulate a question like, is God real? God's a mystery in that question, and so is real. And you don't get away with the axiomatic presupposition that you've got real nailed down, and all we have to do now is mop up God. It's not reasonable. It's not acceptable in the least. It's just a trick, and it's not a very sophisticated trick. And so, in this situation, selfishness versus self-care, well, I think really the issue there is the definition of self. So, whatever the self is very complicated, because it's really what you are at your core. That's the question. That's unbelievably complicated. It's like, what the hell do you know about who you are at your core? I mean, human beings we have no idea what we are in the final analysis. And so Carl Jung wrote books on the self. He believed Christ was a symbol of the self. It's a very complicated idea. It takes a lot of unpacking. You could think about the self as what it is that has demands right now. And when people attempt to define themselves subjectively, which has become something to be insisted upon in our current culture, they usually mean something like, the ultimate self is the whim that possesses me now. And that's a dubious proposition. What the whim that possesses you now is more accurately conceptualized as a fragmentary self. You know, if you have a 2-year-old and the 2-year-old wants something and has a little tantrum in the grocery store because of it, the impulsive demand that possesses that child in that context is a fragmentary part of the child, but it in no means is reflective of the totality of that person. And then you might ask yourself, well, what's the totality? And well, as I said, that's a very complicated problem, but the totality of a person is certainly their iterations across time. It's at least that, right? Because there's a past you, and there's a present you, and there's a future you, and whatever you is in the final analysis is the aggregation of all of that across time. And maybe the aggregation of all of your manifestations in every social context as well. And then I could say, well, if you're taking care of yourself wisely, then you're taking all of that into account simultaneously. And then if that's selfishness, then that could be viewed as a positive good. But if you're subordinating that greater totality to the impulses of a momentary whim, which you've defined as the self, then that's a very bad idea. All that's going to do is cause trouble and make you unpopular. And so I don't believe there's any difference between service to the highest self and service to other people. I think those are the same thing. And we can think about that technically too. So there's a lot of other people and there's only one of you. And you're going to interact with people in a multitude of ways across your life. And you could imagine this, is that if you play fair in every interaction, or if everyone you interact with walks away from your interactions having gained, then everyone is going to line up to play with you. And so how is that going to be anything but good for you? How could anything possibly be better than that?
because you're outnumbered very badly. And so if all the people around you are inclined, because of the way you've conducted yourself, to facilitate your progress forward, why wouldn't that be the best thing for you that could possibly occur? And one of the things I've suggested to my audiences, and people seem to resonate with this quite deeply, is imagine yourself ill and bereft of capacity, suffering. You think, well, what might sustain you during such a time? This is the question that's posed in a marriage, for example, for better or for worse, let's say. And one answer is the fruits of the sacrifices that you offered in relationship to other people previously. And so what does that mean? Well, if you had been responsible and caring, mature, and self-sacrificing in the proper manner, and I don't mean martyrdom, like a nihilistic martyrdom or a resentful martyrdom, then you've stored up, to put it sort of coldly, social capital. And then people will be pleased to return the favor in times of desperation. And that way, if that was the case for all of us all of the time, then we'd be in a mutually sustaining web of interactions. And that's not exactly organizing your psyche, right, so that you can sail through suffering. It's more external. It's that you're storing up your sanity in the reciprocal goodwill that you've built up with other people. And to do that optimally, you do that in a spirit of something like playful love, if you do it optimally. And of course that's going to redound to your great benefit. But even better than that, it's going to redound to your great benefit in a way that's also simultaneously mutually beneficial to as many others as you're skillful enough to manage. This developmental psychologist named Jean Piaget. Piaget is a very interesting thinker. And he was motivated by, his life's goal was to reconcile science and religion. And modern analysts of Piaget generally regard him as a developmental psychologist. But he described himself as a genetic epistemologist. And by genetic, he meant one who analyzes the genesis of things or their beginning. And by epistemologist, he meant someone who analyzes structures of knowledge. And so what Piaget was trying to do was to understand how our structures of knowledge developed across time. He thought if you wanted to pursue philosophy, and even more deeply, let's say theology, then it would make sense to look at how knowledge structures develop from childhood forward, because they're simpler in childhood and you might be able to understand them better than having to dive right into adult cognition. And he got a long ways on his enterprise. I think farther than people realize. He's a very sophisticated thinker. And he had this theory of equilibration, which is a lovely theory. So an equilibrated system will maintain itself without outside compulsion. And you might think, well, that's what you want in a political system, right? Because you want to live in a state that you want to live in. And you all, in fact, live in a state, I don't mean California, I mean the United States, and California less so lately, by the way. You want to live in a state where you don't have to be compelled. You want to be part of an organization that you've bought into voluntarily. And it's so interesting, because that's actually one of the criteria by which you could judge the value of a state. Does the state have to impose its dictates by force? Or does the state offer you a vision that you voluntarily accept and celebrate? And I would say your country has been very, very good at that. I mean, the American dream is not a dream that merely possesses Americans. Right? It's a dream that in some sense has been offered to the whole world. And I would say, you might ask, well, what's the evidence for that? And I would say, how about the fact that people want to move here? That constitutes the evidence. And even though this country is far from perfect, that's not exactly the issue. The issue is it less imperfect than the other offerings? And the answer to that is, well, do people want to move here? And if the answer to that is yes, then that's the evidence. And clearly they want to move here. And there are reasons for that. And the reason for that in some sense is because you're playing an equilibrated game. It's a game that will sustain itself without compulsion. And that's actually the definition of a game. So for Piaget, a game was a microcosm of the promised land. That's a good way of thinking about it, if you want to think about it theologically. So a game is an arrangement of vision shared by two or more players voluntarily. And so when two children decide to play a game together, maybe they decide to play house, the one child who's offering the game might say, do you want to play house? And the other child, say it's a boy and a girl, will say, yeah, I'd like to play house with you. And so then no force is required because both are voluntary participants, and then the children develop a shared vision, which is the confines of the game, to play house. And then they run the simulation, and if they run the simulation properly, then they both find it engaging, and the engagement is a marker for the quality of the game, and the game expands their capacity to perceive and act with skill in relationship to an important life goal, right? Establishing a permanent relationship, because that's what you're practicing when you're playing house. And if that's done optimally, then it doesn't require compulsion. And if the two children are very good at doing that together, then they want to repeat it and continue to develop their skill, and that's what a friendship is. And that's not based on power, right? That's not based on a power relationship. That's so cool to know that, because, you know, the cynics say, well, it's all about power, and they usually say that because they want it to be all about power. But really, but that isn't the basis for stable human relations. Stable human relations are based on the construction of equilibrated states. And if your marriage is equilibrated, you both want to be in it. Now, I mean, there'll be times when you don't, and, you know, you need to abide by the fact that you've accepted some constraints so that, well, you're not equilibrated, you're not getting along, you don't just leave, right? You still fight it through and try to reestablish an equilibrated state. But the idea of equilibrated state is extraordinarily interesting, and it's a vision of paradise. And the proper vision of paradise is something like eternal play. That's a good way of thinking about it. And play is a better basis for the establishment of social relations than power by any measure, by any multitude of measures. And so properly selfish is an equilibrated state across multiple instantiations of games across a very long period of time in very many social contexts. And so if you're serving that, that's enlightened selfishness, you could say. But it's identical with treating other people in the best possible manner. It's the same thing. And we know that, you know, we have an ethos, our culture is predicated on an ethos, which is treat your neighbor as you would like to be treated yourself, or maybe more, love thy neighbor as thyself. And that means to act towards your neighbor as if he or she is capable of producing a sequence of Jacob's ladder-like goals across time, and that you're of the same nature, and that will increase the probability that that direction will be the one that makes itself manifest. And that's definitely the case. I mean, I had people in my clinical practice who had become embittered and resentful. They were often naive people, and people generally start out naive, who'd been betrayed. You know, and they regarded their loss of naivety as an increment in wisdom. And you see this with cynical people, right? And they think, well, I was naive and I got burned, and that's not going to happen again. And it's like, fair enough, that actually is an increment in wisdom, but you're in the desert at that point, right? I mean, the naivety wasn't a virtue. and the collapse is a catastrophe, but the place you end up with is not positive. But you're not going to say, well, I'm not going to drop my cynicism and go back to being naive, because that would actually be a reversal of the acquisition of knowledge. Plus, you know, what they say, once burned, twice shy. So then, well, what's the alternative to the cynicism that's induced by malevolence? And the answer to that is something like, it's something like courageous trust. So imagine that you want to bring the best out of people, even though now you know that there's plenty of the worst there too. And the answer is, well, the question is, how do you do that? And the answer doesn't seem to be by facing everyone with a pervading spirit of distrust and bitterness. That just doesn't seem to work. And you might think, well, that's justified because I've been burned multiple times. Why wouldn't I do that? And the answer has to be something like, because you have the courage not to. Right? If you're not going to fall back into a foolish naivety and not allow yourself to be twisted into nihilism by bitterness, then your option is something like, well, I know perfectly well that you're full of snakes, but I'm going to extend my hand anyway, based on the faith that if you have the courage to do that, that the being that you will call out of the other person is thereby rendered most likely to be of the upward stumbling type. And I think that's the case. You know, you see people who are very sophisticated in their perceptions and social ability, and they can interact even with people who are quite corrupt and still increase the probability quite dramatically that the interaction will be positive. And that's part of that impulse towards the development of an equilibrated state. And so to reach out your hand like that to your fallen brother, let's say, without being naive, that's part and parcel of acting out that highest order conception of the self. That's the logos. That's how that works. So that's an answer to that question. If you study the development of the fantasies of very, very dark people, you see that they brood and fantasize in isolation for years. And the fantasies get darker and darker and darker. So they're bitter and resentful to begin with. And then they start fantasizing about, well, what they would want. That can take a sexual end, or it can take a very violent end, or it can take both. And what they're really after is the ultimate in revenge. And on the sexual front, they find a kick in extending the, what would you call it, unacceptability of the fantasy one stage at a time. The famous and extremely attractive sexual serial killer, what was his name? There's a famous photograph of him like this, a very attractive man. Do you remember his name?
Ted Bundy.
Anybody? Ted Bundy. Ted Bundy detailed out exactly how his fantasies progressed as he became more and more involved with pornography. And what happens in some sense is that these people who are nursing these terrible fantasies want to stay on the edge of novelty. And so their fantasies get darker and darker and darker as they progress down that road. And so after 1,000 such micro progressions, they end up in exactly the sort of pit that you're describing. And some of that is pure sexual kick because of the novelty. But it's got this sadistic and perverse, vengeful twist. And you could think about it this way. You know, I think it says in the Gospels that, you know, it would be better that a millstone was hung around your neck and that you were cast into the abyss than to do harm to any of God's children, let's say. And that's actually where the perverse delight comes, because the most egregious possible sin, let's say, is the violent sexual abuse of the most innocent possible person. And the perverse novelty kick is highest at exactly that point. And then that just goes from bad to worse. And there's 1,000 or even 10,000 micro decisions that go along with that. There's also a great book called Ordinary Men. This is well worth reading, although it's a bloody catastrophe to read, I'll tell you. It details out how a group of German policemen who were moved to Poland during World War II were transformed from ordinary middle-class ordinary working class men, old enough to not have been raised under the Nazi regime, by the way, and so not propagandized into a kind of mindless obedience, how they went from being perfectly ordinary policemen to the sort of people who could take naked pregnant women out into the middle of a field and shoot them in the back of the head. And it isn't like they had an easy time with that. Some of them reported the same sort of thing that you reported when you first watched that video. What they were being called upon to do stage by stage made them physically ill. And they had a commander who actually had told them that they could leave the service if they didn't want to continue with their duties. But they felt duty bound not to leave their comrades having to mop up the terrible situation. But it does a lovely job of detailing out how your movement from normality to absolute perversity is a consequence of 10,000 micro, what would you say, micro violations of your own conscience. Not all of them micro, obviously. So you need to know about the vengefulness. You need to know about the kick of sadism. That's that novelty kick that produces a dopaminergic kick that heightens sexual satisfaction. And so there's an element of sadistic misery that can add novelty to sex. That's particularly attractive to people who are bitter and resentful because they actually can't find any willing sexual partners. And so they're angry at the world and shake their fist at God because of it. And so anyways, that's a bit of the developmental course of such a lovely descent into hell. And the interesting thing about it is that people brood, like you don't get to the point where you're watching pornographic videos of children being raped without hundreds or even thousands of hours of increasingly demented voluntary fantasy. And that's that allowing the spirit of sin that would otherwise crouch on your doorstep to enter your house and have its way with you, right? It's like a collaborative venture with Satan himself. That's the most straightforward way of describing it. And so, that's, I don't know what you have to say about that, but I'll let you have at her.
I'll say this, that everything you're saying absolutely resonates with my anecdotal experiences dealing with these people. I look into their eyes, and what you're describing is what I see, though I've never been able to articulate it like you just have. So I appreciate being armed with an understanding that it will help me evangelize more clearly to others about the dangers of overstimulation and overuse of pornography and shaking hands with the devil. So thank you for that. That was very insightful.
So I spent a bit of time, not a lot, but a bit of time inside a maximum security prison when I was a kid. I worked with a very strange psychologist that was there. And one of the things that really shocked me, and I think this shocked me enough to change my whole life, was I met this one prisoner who was a pretty nondescript looking character. He took me for a walk out in the yard away from a gym full of like weightlifting, axe murderer, monsters, and rapists. And we went for a walk out in the yard, and the psychologist called us back and told me later in the office that this guy, who was about 5'2", pretty non-prepossessing guy, had made two policemen kneel in front of him, beg for their lives in reference to their families, and then shot them both in the back of the head and kicked them aside. And the shocking thing to me was, you kind of think that if you met pure evil, it would have a monstrous form. And, the thing that shocked me about that was the nondescript nature of this guy, his absolutely banal ordinariness, the fact that you could just walk past him on the street and you'd never know. He wasn't some monster, the monstrous character of Satan in your imagination is, a figure that's terrifying to behold instead of someone normal. You know what I mean? Normal in that cringing sense. These people that you've interacted with, like, what's your reaction to them when you talk to them, the pedophiles, when you talk to them and when you arrest them?
My experience is very similar to what you just described. Very nondescript, people of all walks of life. We've arrested and I've interrogated educators, lawyers, law enforcement, clergymen, and sitting across from them, but with no apparent physicality that would tell you who they are. But I will say this: when they start talking and I look into their eyes, that's when I sense something that really scares the hell out of me. And the way they talk about children when they get there, and it's something that they've been able to normalize, and they're speaking to me about children almost like they're talking about, you know, the weather, or, you know, talking about buying and selling children like you talk about buying and selling computer parts, or an automobile or something. And that's where I thought, something has taken over you. Something non-human has made you less human. And I've never been able to figure it out, only that it creeps me out. And I usually end up getting them to confess, because they have brought themselves to a place where they think they're okay. They think that it's somehow normal. I don't know if that makes sense.
How do they,
Dr. Peterson?
Well, the degree of rationalization that has to, with each step forward in the progress of the fantasy, there has to be a step forward in the self-deception with regards to self-description, right? So imagine that you're attempting to cling to a sense of yourself at least as normal, but even maybe as a moral agent. I mean, the more forthright pedophiles claim that they're only allowing children to express their true sexual desires, and that what they're actually doing is forming the best relationship with the children that they've ever had. Now, of course, there's part of them that knows that that's an absolutely bloody, screaming, hellish lie. But you get to that lie, like I said, with 1,000 micro lies, right? And you're modifying your self-conception along the way. I mean, have you had these people justify themselves to you? And if so, by what means do they attempt to do that?
So one person that comes to mind, absolutely, the answer is yes. And one person that comes to mind is the person depicted in the film Oshensky. This person had written articles, self-published, of course. He had a book that he actually sold on Amazon, and his understanding, or his justification, was that the puritanical society of this country has crushed the true and beautiful and righteous sexual experience, which the most natural would be between a man and a child, a prepubescent child. A prepubescent child is the most beautiful form of humanity, and why take that away from a child? Children would be well conditioned to confront the challenges of life, if only they could experience orgasmic pleasure even in their prepubescence. This is how they talk.
Right. Well, that you saw echoes of that. There was attempts made in the 1970s by French intellectuals, surprise, surprise, to have the age of consent reduced radically. And that was always the rationale. It was an extension of the patriarchal oppression theory in some sense, right? That all sexual expression is essentially pure and good in its most fundamental form. And it's all warped by social pressure. And if we were just allowed to express ourselves in every manner that we saw fit, then everyone would be free and we wouldn't suffer anymore from the constraints of tyrannical society, right? And it's just convenient for the bloody pedophiles that happens to justify them doing whatever the hell they want to children who are obviously too young to consent. You ever seen Robert Crumb's representations of bird-headed women?
No, I haven't.
Robert Crumb's an underground cartoonist, and he was the feature of a documentary which you and everybody else who's listening to this should definitely watch. It's the best documentary I've ever seen about anything ever. He draws these women. He was a loser in high school by his own admission, by every single category you could possibly generate. And so it's a study in loser psychology, but it's really complex because he was a loser who was extremely intelligent and unbelievably creative, and who had two brothers who were probably more intelligent, more creative than him, although also more psychopathological. And then he became successful. He was one of the establishers of underground cartooning back in the 1960s, and spawned arguably even graphic novel. You know, I mean, he's a major player in that niche, and the documentary is a brilliant analysis of the relationship between failure and success, and sexual failure and sexual success. Because in one memorable scene, he talks about, he drew this card when he was a high school kid of a heart being ripped apart when he got rejected by this girl or by all girls. He said he was beneath contempt. He wasn't even in the category of comprehensible dating partner, right? He was outside the game entirely. So he's rejected by the feminine as such. He draws these pictures of bird-headed women with teeth, you know, and they're powerful, big thighs, big rear end, like powerful, physically powerful, intimidating women, like mothers, draws sometimes these characters of little tiny men climbing up the legs of these huge tree-like women, but they're very aggressive and domineering. And the reason for that, at least in part, is because every woman he ever approached was rejecting and aggressive in the extreme, treated him with nothing but contempt. And then he says in an unbelievably memorable piece of the documentary, that all changed when I got successful. And you can just hear the resentment and the bitterness in his voice, even though it did change. And he wasn't that old when he became successful. He was in his mid-20s. You know, plenty of time to be on the outs completely and to experience life at the bottom of the male dominance hierarchy and even farther down the female dominance hierarchy, let's say, in terms of desirable men. It's called Crumb, the documentary. I would highly recommend it. And it's absolutely brilliant study. And he had an authoritarian father and indulgent mother, and she plays a key role in the documentary. And it's awful. It's awful. It's a study in Freudian psychopathology that's deep beyond belief. I've seen it like 40 times, showing it to my classes and walking through it clip by clip. But anyways, it's a study. You don't see the world from the perspective of down and out male loser. You know, there are subcultures that sort of exist there, but this is the only examination of that place in the world I've ever seen that I thought really, really nailed it. The documentarist was a friend of the family, so and Charles' brothers, one of them ended up a sexual offender who lived on the streets of San Francisco, and the other committed suicide by drinking furniture polish when he was like 55, after being bullied terribly in high school and living in his mother's basement, essentially, for his entire life. Ugh, awful, awful. But, you know, you watch the documentary, it's not like people really, you generate some compassion for the people in the documentary and what they've gone through. But I wouldn't say that compassion is what's primarily elicited by the documentary. And that goes back to this discussion we had right at the beginning about, you know, what kind of empathy we have for the men who aren't making it. And the answer seems to be very, very little. Let's go to social policy with that. We might ask, okay, in light of this, what do we do? And I would say this is what I've recommended. I've recommended to young men that that these are the facts on the ground and they're not going to change. And that if you're being rejected chronically by women, or if you're terrified out of your mind about that, and perhaps rightly so, you should take a good hard look at yourself and see what it is that you have to offer. And so, like, are you as educated as you could be? Are you working? You know, are you looking for a job at least? Are you trying to get out of your parents' house? Are you taking the steps necessary to become gainfully employed, productive, generous, and attractive? And, you know, that tangles us back up with something we also talked about in the beginning, which is the criticisms that have been directed my way by men, which is, well, you're asking men to live up to a stereotype that essentially undermines and devalues the vast majority of them. You're part of the problem, not part of the solution. And your emphasis on responsible marriage, given the state of current family law, is nothing short of reprehensible. And so, you know, my approach is do what you can at the individual level to put yourself in the game. But there's much more to the story than that.
Absolutely. This is really complex because the good news is there's a lot you can do to choose a woman who is the right woman. And so, for example, looking at when you both go out to dinner, is she open to paying? If she isn't paying, does she cook a dinner for you the next time around? How does she treat the waiter? Somebody that can't do her any good. Ask her about her former relationships, how they broke up, and who was at fault. Is there any accountability and responsibility on her part? Of course, ask these same questions of yourself as well, especially about former relationships and how they broke up. And so that's so choosing the right woman is probably.
And so what are you looking for there? You're looking for generosity. You're looking for kindness down the hierarchy, right? So that's how does she treat people who are social inferiors, so to speak, at least in that context, like waiters. And then with regards to previous relationships, is she capable of some self-analysis, or is it always the guy's fault? That reminds me of that Atlantic Monthly article, one of them. I unfortunately can't remember who wrote it, but it was this woman in her late 40s detailing out all the high quality men that she had rejected, many, many, many men by her own account. And during the entire article, there wasn't any recognition whatsoever of any time when it might have been her. It was like, these 40 men didn't live up to my standards. It's like, well, after the fifth one, didn't you start thinking maybe the problem was on the other side of the dating table? But the answer was obviously no, and she was obviously still single. So what are you looking for there exactly? And why did you bring that up at that point?
Well, because one of the ways that you can be involved in the game of marriage in a way that is positive is by making the choice of the woman differently than what we tend to do. Many men look at a woman, she's beautiful, and our desire to be sexual with her leads us to sort of, okay, we'll pay for dinner, we'll promise this, we'll go here, we'll go there. And
yes,
then,
we should point out too, I just want to point out something. I talked to Randy Thornhill recently, one of the world's preeminent biologists. And before we get to thinking that this sexual attractiveness is nothing more than mere shallow-mindedness and impulsive gratification, is all the cues of sexual attractiveness are tightly associated with physical health and fecundity, which is the ability to procreate. And so even if men are blinded by beauty, which I do believe is true enough, their reasons for that at the deepest possible level still have to do with the desire to continue the human species. So it's shallow in one sense, but not in another. But your point is there are other markers that are characterological, that are more subtle, that need to be taken into account.
Yes, both sexes have very huge reproductive draws. I mean, from an insect right on up through human beings, women tend to procreate and have children with the alpha male. A good example of this is buck elks. And among buck elks, the females, 85% of them will have reproduce with the male that has the biggest rack. But what it takes to get that biggest rack is an exhaustion of 30% of the minerals, nutrients, and calcium in the buck elk. So the second that he reproduces, if he doesn't get rid of his rack immediately, he's likely to die before winter sets in, and he's able to replenish the nutrients and the minerals and so on. So his rack was very productive for being able to procreate. It was very productive for being able to attract the female, but it was also his weakness and that's very symbolic of men, that men's weakness is our facade of strength, because it was strength because we could use that rack, or not me, but the buck elks could use that rack to get rid of other predators or people that the female didn't want, to protect the female when she was creating the child and so on. But he was also being used for being part of the next generation's benefit of producing the next generation's machine. And as you said, once we have children, we really live for the next generation. And so now then the next question becomes, as humans, do we want to create more options for ourselves? And are we at a point now where survival is mastered enough in the middle and upper middle class that we have then we are chosen merely for our success? And I think the best explanation of that comes in Japan, where the millennials in Japan have a game called karoshi. And of course, karoshi means death at the desk or death from overwork. And the game, each person has a little karoshi figure, and they compete to get to the top of the ladder. It might be the political ladder, it might be the economic ladder, it might be the religious ladder. And as they compete to get to the top of the ladder, the one who gets to the top of the ladder first commits suicide. not in real life, but in the game. And the point that the Japanese millennials are communicating with each other is that that what we did to become that successful man, who was the most attracted, who was the most able to be eligible for sex and for love, is we unbecame a human doing, climbing to the top of the ladder. We unbecame a human being. We didn't even think of ourselves as a human being. That's why we're committing suicide. We have just by competing to be at the top of the ladder, we've worried about what position we wanted, working more hours, pleasing the boss, pleasing the corporation, not selling something we wanted or doing something we wanted. And we never even considered ourselves as a human being. And so now we Japanese millennials are going to start looking at the loss of ourselves as human doings, the loss of ourselves rather as human beings. And that is, and that's in my opinion, where we need to consider going. That as we have children, there's this balancing act of helping our children see the value of being that artist, that painter, that's doing what you love to do, combined with, is it creating enough income to be responsible to your family to do that? And yes, it will lose you some women, but if you're developing emotional skills and emotional intelligence, that may not attract as many women as the football player that risks his life and spinal cord injury, but it may attract the type of woman you want.
What emotion do you feel when you're going to approach someone you're very attracted to, and there's an extremely high probability that she's going to tell you to disappear? Right, exactly, absolutely, because it's a real judgment, right? We're going to see a movie called Crumb where you'll see this in great detail, but it's a real judgment. It's like the best judgment is, well, I don't mind your physical presence, but your genes should definitely not survive another generation. Right, and that's sort of generally translated into, I think we should just be friends. Right, you know, and you can blow that off, and people do, and you have to, because it's part of being polite and civilized, but, you know, let's make no mistake about it. There is no more fundamental judgment than that. So, paralysis, and there's no shortage of men, I mean, who are absolutely terrified of women. I mean, I've had many of them in my practice, you know. I had one guy, he was so terrified of women, he couldn't even talk to them on the phone. It's more common than you think. So, but it's generally manifested by men who no one cares about, so it's generally irrelevant. So, well, it's the case. It really is the case. I'm not kidding. They're low status men. You know, they're people that are generally regarded as losers, and there isn't anybody who really gives a damn about what happens to them one way or another, and there's a lot more men in that category than there are women. Women are in all sorts of, you know, social categories that cause them misery and distress, but that one seems to be predominantly male. One of the things I'm going to do when we talk about Freud is I'm going to show you this movie Crumb, which I just told you about, and it's a very rare thing because it shows you the world from the perspective of very intelligent male losers, and that's just not a perspective you ever see, because it's the winners that tell the stories about their life. It's like, who the hell cares about the life of a loser? But this movie is about a loser who became a winner, and, you know, almost as an act of revenge, and it's great. It's great examination of the Oedipal complex. Remarkable. Women select men. That makes them nature, because nature is what selects. And so, you know, you can say, well, it's only symbolic that women are nature. It is, not in some sense, is the gatekeeper to reproductive success, and you can't get more like nature than that. In fact, it's the very definition of nature. So, as I said, there are lots of reasons why these symbolic representations are set up the way they are. All right, so that's the great mother, nature. The queen, the matrix. The matrix is something from which all things form. Same root word as matter, mother, all the same root word. The matriarch, the container, the cornucopia, the object to be fertilized, the source of all things, the fecund, the pregnant. There are more parts of the associational network. The strange, the emotional, the foreigner, the place of return and rest. The deep, the valley, the cleft, the cave, hell, death, and the grave, the moon, ruler of the night and the mysterious dark. and matter in the earth. So those aren't necessarily associated with femininity, but they're typically associated with femininity from a symbolic perspective. You know, so like generally, like a witch in a movie doesn't come riding out of the full bright sun at noon, right? That just doesn't happen because it doesn't make sense. It's a dark thing. And so if you saw that occurring in the light in a movie, you'd think, you know, what the hell's going on here? That doesn't make sense. And the reason it doesn't make sense is because it violates the complex, the symbolic complex. So those are female denizens of the underworld and hell. Very pleasant creatures. It's like Medusa with the head of snakes, you know. And if you ask, you know, why would a woman have a head of snakes in reference to a man? And that's really simple. I bet there are men here who know the answer to that. I don't know what you guys think about this, but I was pretty happy when I thought this up, and it took me a long time. So, if you think about the world in Darwinian terms, right, it's a struggle for survival and reproduction, which are basically the same thing. Survival is you, but reproduction is the survival of your genes. So it's a survival issue over very long spans of time. Okay, what do we call the selection mechanism? Right, natural selection, right? It's nature who does the selection. Okay, so let me tell you something that makes female humans different than female chimps. I mean, there's lots of things that do, but but here's an important one. If you look at which male in a chimp troop fathers most of the offspring, it's the dominant male. But the reason for that isn't because the female chimps sort of flock around the dominant male. Now that happens in other species, but it doesn't happen with chimps. What happens is the dominant male chases all the subordinate males away and will interfere with any sexual behavior they manifest. It'll chase them away. The females, though, are perfectly happy to mate with a subordinate male if they're in heat and they get the opportunity. So they go into heat, which is something that doesn't happen with female humans, and they really don't care who they mate with. Okay, female humans are much different than that. They're picky. So they're choosy. It's a big deal. It's a big deal that they're choosy. Women also seem to evaluate men for their fitness. Now, so, lots of men have no sexual partners and they have no children. That's not the case with women. Almost all women have one child or more. And it's a rare woman indeed who cannot find a sexual partner. Some of you undoubtedly have already experienced what it's like to be possessed by a particularly stupid idea. You know, so maybe you've grown out of one or two of the stupid ideas that possessed you, or maybe you're possessed by an attraction to someone you can't control, or you can't control your eating behavior, or you're a pushover when it comes to interpersonal interactions because you're too agreeable, or you fly off the handle and fight, and you know, none of this is really under your control. And so all of those things that manifest themselves not only in your behaviors but in your perceptions themselves, you know, they tend to take on embodied form and use you as the vehicle for their activity. So, you know, when you're thinking about something like anger, for example, think about how it works, because it's quite peculiar. What must someone generally do? How must someone generally act if you're going to be angry at them? They have to be irritating, right? You know, they have to provoke you in some way. Well, the mere fact that you perceive what they're doing as irritating or provoking doesn't ensure that anyone else would have thought about it, or that that's what they meant, or that that's what's happening. And my point is, it's very important to think about these complexes of ideas as subpersonalities, because otherwise you really don't get what they're like. If you're angry, if you have a proclivity towards anger, especially if it's an unthinking proclivity, anything that someone says might irritate you. And it isn't like they say something and you think about it and then you get irritated. It's like you perceive the person as irritating. You know, maybe it's just the way they hold their mouth or something. It can be very, very subtle. And you might say, well, it's not me, it's you. It's not that I'm irritated by you. It's that you're irritating. And that, you know, that's a very difficult thing to settle, because the reality is somewhere between the subjective and the objective, right? A lot of arguments that you'll have with people throughout your life are about exactly that. Are you irritating or am I oversensitive? It's like, well, you know, we're going to hash that out for a good long time before we figure it out. But the point is that if you're possessed by an emotional state or a motivational state or an idea or some kind of complex, you'll see the world through its eyes. And then the facts reveal themselves to you through the lens of that particular set of ideas. So it's a very frightening idea because, you know, we like to think of ourselves as masters of our own house, which is completely clueless because it's obvious if you watch yourself for like a month that you hardly ever do what you tell yourself to do, and you're liable to do all sorts of other things that you don't even want to do. You know, because you say, well, I'm going to go to the gym 3 times a week and I'm not going to drink, you know, and maybe there's this person I'm not going to associate with, and then, you know, you don't go to the gym and you find that person and you go out and drink with them and you think, what the hell's going on, you know? But you're not the sort of person that will do what you say. And so, like, what sort of person are you? Well, that's a psychoanalytic question. It's a deep one, because you're a peculiar thing, and there's parts of you that are really, really, really old, and you know, the sort of naive you, the naive young you that you think of yourself as is like a little piece of flotsam in an ocean of complexity, and the ocean of complexity is you. And part of diving down into the depths is to start to understand what it means to be human, and like, whatever that means, it's the one thing you can say about it for sure is that it's bloody peculiar.
There's always people out there who are doing far better than you on pretty much anything you want to imagine. And if all you're doing is seeing yourself in their reflected light, let's say, then it's going to be pretty damn dismal. But it's not a good comparison because, well, first of all, there's danger in just comparing yourself to others, period, because they're not you. And God only knows what struggles they had to undertake to get to where they were, or what burdens they're currently carrying that you're not aware of. But you can certainly contrast yourself with yourself. And that's a lot better. It is the only way. Well, it's also the only way of really measuring anything approximating proper improvement. You can actually tell when you're a little better than you were yesterday.
Right.
And you can actually do that. That's another thing that's so interesting about it, is that you can actually make yourself a little better in some way, pretty much, well, I don't know if it's at every moment, but you can certainly do it every day. You're quite different from other people, and you shouldn't be comparing yourself to them because they're not like you. You know, they don't have your family. They don't have your temperament. They don't have your troubles. They don't have your abilities. The only person that has those is you. Compare yourself to who you were yesterday and not to who someone else is today. And see, that's a game you can win. Be careful who you share good news with, because you want to share good news with people who are going to be genuinely happy for you, and that's one way that you can identify those people who are really on your side. Be careful who you share bad news with, because that's equally tricky. You know, you want someone who will listen to you when you're having trouble and allow you your grief, especially if it's a consequence of something tragic, and who won't try to one-up you, you know, because often when you're talking to people, they'll be thinking about what they have to say that's worse, and that's not helpful if you need a listening ear. Make one room in your house as beautiful as possible. I talked a lot already about the necessity of cleaning your room, which is, you know, in some sense a foolish piece of advice because it seems so obvious, but it's not obvious at all. And you'll find if you try it, especially if you're in a household that's not very functional, that you'll encounter obstacles that you couldn't imagine existed while you're trying to put your life in order. And you can take your surroundings beyond order and move towards beauty, and that's unbelievably useful. One of the things that I've been you know, there's lots of different ways to interpret the world, and you can maybe even make a case that there's an endless number of ways to interpret the world. And the problem with that is that it kind of disorients you in terms of what you should be doing. But just because there's a very large number of ways to interpret the world doesn't mean there's a very large number of productive, meaningful, and sustainable ways to interpret the world. And one of the things you do have to do is figure out how you can conduct yourself today so that you don't upset the apple cart in a week or a month or a year. And so, you know, what you do in some sense psychologically is you admit to yourself that your current frame of reference is faulty. Mm-hmm. And then you start opening the door to a different kind of thinking, which is more creative thinking. It's more lateral thinking. Saying, well, I'm wrong, but that's not necessarily a problem because I could be right if I thought some other way. Well, you know, that's great. Often it works.
Yeah.
And there's almost no end to the utility of trying to figure out which ways that you're wrong. because there's lots of them. And every time you discover one, then you don't have to be quite so wrong anymore. That's a really good deal.
Yeah.
It's from the uphill climb that we derive our value, and I mean this technically. So almost all the positive emotion we feel, especially the emotion that fills us with enthusiasm, and that's experienced in relationship to a goal. And so in some sense, you want a goal that you can never attain. So you can always move closer to the goal that recedes as you move towards it. You think, well, that's frustrating. It's like Sisyphus pushing the rock uphill. But it's not, because as you pursue that goal, you put yourself together and your life does get better and richer and more abundant. And that's why the highest levels of virtue and goal are in some sense transcendent. You want them to be above everything you're doing so you can continually move towards something that's more sublime and better. That's what you are. You're here to live, not to sleep. And the problem with the vision of Mai Tais on the beach is that, well, first of all, that's a vision of drug-induced unconsciousness. Second, it's only going to work for about a week. Third, you're going to be a laughingstock in a month and depressed and aimless and goalless. You want a horizon of ever expanding possibility. And so it does happen to people because they've staked their soul on the attainment of an instrumental goal. And it can be a pretty high order goal, but then you think, now I'm there, now what? Well, the answer can't be, well, I'm going to live in the lap of luxury and never have to leave the face. What do you want to be, a giant infant with a gold bottle? You never have to do anything but lay in your back and suck. It's like, you see the problem with that as a conceptualization. It's no, you want to be like an active warrior moving uphill with your sword in hand. And that's dynamic, that's exciting. Lay a disciplinary structure on yourself, get the chaos in check, and then you can move towards a state that's freer. It's discipline first. Like, look, if you're going to become a concert pianist, there's going to be several thousand hours of extraordinarily disciplined practice. That's the imposition of order on your potential, let's say. But what comes out of that is a much grander freedom. And so virtually every freedom that you have in life that's true freedom is purchased at the price of discipline.
That it's not some casual self-help doctrine. It's that if you don't organize yourself properly, you'll pay for it, and in a big way, and so will the people around you. And I would say, start where you can start. You know, if something announces itself to you as in need of repair, that you could repair, then hey, fix it. You fix 100 things like that, your life will be a lot different. Now, I often tell people too, fix the things you repeat every day, because people tend to think of those as trivial. You get up, you brush your teeth, you have your breakfast, you have your routines that you go through every day. Well, those probably constitute 50% of your life. And people think, well, they're mundane, I don't need to pay attention to them. It's like, no, that's exactly wrong. The things you do every day, those are the most important things you do, hands down. People are afraid of the truth because often if you reveal it, it causes conflict in the moment. Telling the truth is definitely an adventure. Seeking for sure, but also telling. Another way of going about it is to just say what you think and see what happens. That's an adventure because you don't know what the outcome is going to be. So look, there's this old idea that it's necessary to have faith in the truth. And so here's a way of thinking about that. Someone asks you a question and you might think, well, here's the outcome I want, and so here's how I'm going to answer that question. So that's one way of approaching it. But another way of approaching it is, you ask me a question, I'm going to think about the answer, and I'm just going to tell you what I think. And it doesn't matter what the outcome is, because I'm willing to see what the outcome will be, predicated on the idea that there isn't a better outcome than the one that truth produces. Even if it's harsh and terrible in the short term, and sometimes it is, it's like there isn't a better way of doing it. Now, you might say, well, how do you know that? And the answer is, well, I don't know that. That's why it's an article of faith, because I believe, and I believe this deeply, the being that you produce as a consequence of telling the truth is good, by definition, even though it's harsh and often uncomfortable, because you get in trouble. One of the things that I've really learned recently, or learned to articulate better, is that there's a very tight relationship between aspiration and responsibility. The first question might be, do you need to aspire to something? And the answer is, well, yes, because you have to do something. If you just sit there, you'll die. You can't just sit there. You have to go act out in the world. Okay, so act towards what? Well, that's whatever your aspiration is. You have to have an aim. Okay, well, what should the aim be? Well, it should be something worth doing, let's say. Why do something that you don't feel is worth doing? What do you think's worth doing? Well, if you watch other people and you judge when they're doing something worthwhile, you usually judge them positively if you see that they're taking responsibility, at least for themselves. What, do you want to be completely useless so other people have to take care of you? That's pretty pathetic. And maybe you could get your act together so you're taking care of yourself and your family. And maybe you could even do better than that and take care of yourself and your family and your community. Well, good for you. That's responsibility, and that's an aim. Well, here's one of the things that's cool about that, is that your life doesn't have meaning without aspiration or an aim. Okay, so you need a hierarchy of values. There's got to be something at the top. It's got to be something important. If you don't have that, your life doesn't have any meaning. So if you criticize the hierarchy, or even the idea of hierarchy, you destroy the idea of aspiration, and then people have nothing. Well, that's not helpful. People are built for a struggle and they're built for a weight, and you want to take on a heavy burden voluntarily. See if you can put yourself together. See what you can do out in the world while you're waiting to die. It's an all-in game. It better be worthwhile. The great people I know are brutally truthful to themselves and other people, and they have insanely adventurous lives. Get rid of everything you say that you only say to impress other people, and just see if you can say what you believe to be true. That's an adventure. That's the thing about the truth, you know? Well, you got to ask yourself, if you're not speaking the truth, who is it that's talking? If you're saying something that you do not believe to be true, it's not you talking. It's something else. It might be the part of you that wants to manipulate the other person into delivering what you think you want from them. Well, what is that spirit of manipulation that you've allowed to possess you? It's not you. Let's say you decide to live your whole life in that instrumental manner. You're going to craft your words like the student who says, well, I'm going to write what the professor wants to hear so I get the grade. It's like, well, you just turn yourself into that. Well, who is it that's doing that manipulating? It's not you, because those aren't your words. So even if you get the grade, it's not you that got the grade. It's the false you. It's the manipulative you. So you do that your whole life. You don't have your life. And then you think, well, God, that was a miserable life. I manipulated everybody. They were so damn stupid. They were sucked in by it. They're all contemptible. Everyone does it, you know, which they don't, by the way. And so that's a pathway to bitterness. Partly because if you're a manipulator and you use your language falsely, you don't live your own life. You live the life of whatever possesses you when you think it's you manipulating. And so you live the life of the spirit of manipulation. You know, maybe you're in California, see someone speeding down the road in a convertible Porsche, and you think, oh man, what a lucky bastard. And the truth of the matter is that he's thinking about wrapping his expensive sports car around the next cement pillar that he comes close to. You know, you can't tell. And people have hard lives, and even people who are comparatively fortunate have hard lives. And the ideal that you're observing that makes you jealous and resentful is in large part an illusion that's created by your own mind. You have to be careful of what you're jealous of, because you don't really know what it is. And then the other thing that's kind of useful is to understand you're quite different from other people, and you shouldn't be comparing yourself to them, because they're not like you. They don't have your family. They don't have your temperament. They don't have your troubles. They don't have your abilities. The only person that has those is you. This is the Peter Pan story, roughly speaking. Peter Pan is this magical boy. Pan is the god of everything, roughly speaking, right? And so it's not an accident that he has the name Pan. And he's the boy that won't grow up. And he's magical. Well, that's because children are magical. They can be anything. They're nothing but potential. And Peter Pan doesn't want to give that up. Why? Well, he's got some adults around him, but the main adult is Captain Hook. Well, who the hell wants to grow up to be Captain Hook? First of all, you've got a hook. Second, you're a tyrant. And third, you're chased by the dragon of chaos with a clock in its stomach, right? The crocodile. It's already got a piece of you. Well, that's what happens when you get older. Time has already got a piece of you. And eventually, it's got a taste for you. And eventually, it's going to eat you. And so Hook is so traumatized by that he can't help but be a tyrant. And then Peter Pan looks at traumatized Hook and says, well, no, I'm not sacrificing my childhood for that. So that's fine, except he ends up king of the Lost Boys. in Neverland, well, Neverland doesn't exist, and who the hell wants to be king of the Lost Boys? And he also sacrifices the possibility that he'll have a real relationship with a woman, because that's Wendy, right? And she's kind of conservative, middle-class, London-dwelling girl. She wants to grow up and have kids and have a life. She accepts her mortality, she accepts her maturity. Peter Pan has to content himself with Tinkerbell. She doesn't even exist. She's like the fairy of porn. She doesn't exist. She's the substitute for the real thing. But the dichotomy that you're talking about is very tricky, because there's a sacrificial element in maturation, right? You have to sacrifice the pluripotentiality of childhood for the actuality of a frame. And the question is, well, why would you do that? Well, one reason is it happens to you whether you do it or not. You can either choose your damn limitation, or you can let it take you unaware when you're 30, or even worse, when you're 40. And then that is not a happy day. I see people like this, and I think it's more and more common in our culture, because people can put off maturity without suffering an immediate penalty. But all that happens is the penalty accrues, and then when it finally hits, it just wallops you, because when you're 25, you could be an idiot. It's no problem. Even when you're out in a job search, it's like, well, you don't have any experience and you're kind of clueless. It's, yeah, you're young, it's no problem. That's what young people are like, but they're full of potential. Okay, well, now you're the same person at 30. It's like people aren't so thrilled about you at that point. It's like, what the hell have you been doing for the last 10 years? Well, I'm just as clueless as I was when I was 22. Yeah, but you're not 22. You're an old infant, right? And that's an ugly thing, an old infant. So, part of the reason you choose your damn sacrifice, because the sacrifice is inevitable, but at least you get to choose it. And then there's something that's even more complex than that in some sense, is that the problem with being a child is that all you are is potential, and it's really low resolution. You could be anything, but you're not anything. So then you go and you adopt an apprenticeship, roughly speaking, and then at least you become something. And when you're something, that makes the world open up to you again. Like if you're a really good plumber, then you end up being far more than a plumber. Like you end up being a good employer. If you're a really good plumber, well, then you have some employees, you run a business, you train some other people, you enlarge their lives, you're kind of a pillar of the community, you have your family. Once you pass through that narrow training period, which narrows you and constricts you and develops you at the same time, then you can come out the other end with a bunch of new possibility at hand. And Jung talked about that. He thought that part of the proper path of development in the last half of life was to rediscover the child that you left behind as you were apprenticing. And so then you get to be something and regain that potential at the same time. Very, very smart. Well, he was very, very smart. So that's very wise thing to know. So, yeah. Sacrifice. You get to pick your damn sacrifice. That's all. You don't get to not make one. You're sacrificial whether you want to be or not. That's a good thing to know as well. Someone who is incapable of cruelty is a higher moral being than someone who is capable of cruelty. And I would say, and this follows Jung as well, that that's incorrect, and it's dangerously incorrect, because if you are not capable of cruelty, you are absolutely a victim to anyone who is. And so part of the reason that people go watch anti-heroes and villains is because there's a part of them crying out for the incorporation of the monster within them, which is what gives them strength of character and self-respect, because it's impossible to respect yourself until you grow teeth. And if you grow teeth, then you realize that you're somewhat dangerous, or maybe somewhat seriously dangerous, and then you might be more willing to demand that you treat yourself with respect and other people do the same thing. And so that doesn't mean that being cruel is better than not being cruel. What it means is that being able to be cruel and then not being cruel is better than not being able to be cruel. Because in the first case, you're nothing but weak and naive. And in the second case, you're dangerous, but you have it under control. And you know, a lot of martial arts concentrate on exactly that as part of their philosophy of training. It's like, we're not training you to fight. We're training you to be peaceful and awake and avoid fights. But if you happen to have to get in one, and I guess the philosophy also is that if you're competent at fighting, that actually decreases the probability that you're going to have to fight, because when someone pushes you, you'll be able to respond with confidence, and with any luck, and this is certainly the case with bullies, with any luck, a reasonable show of confidence, which is very much equivalent to a show of dominance, is going to be enough to make the bully back off. And so the strength that you develop in your monstrousness is actually the best guarantee of peace. And that's partly why Jung believed that it was necessary for people to integrate their shadow. And he said that was a terrible thing for people to attempt, because the human shadow, which is all those things about yourself that you don't want to realize, reaches all the way to hell. And what he meant by that was, it's through an analysis of your own shadow that you can come to understand why other people are capable, and you as well, of the sorts of terrible atrocities that characterized, let's say, the 20th century. And without that understanding, there's no possibility of bringing it under control. When you study Nazi Germany, for example, or you study the Soviet Union, particularly under Stalin, and you're asking yourself, well, what are these perpetrators like? Forget about the victims, let's talk about the perpetrators. The answer is, they're just like you. And if you don't know that, that just means that you don't know anything about people, including yourself. And then it also means that you have to discover why they're just like you. And believe me, that's no picnic. So that's enough to traumatize people, and that's partly why they don't do it. And it's also partly why the path to enlightenment and wisdom is seldom trod upon, because if it was all a matter of following your bliss and doing what made you happy, then everyone in the world would be a paragon of wisdom. But it's not that at all. It's a matter of facing the thing you least want to face.